It's a distant connection. This was one of those times where I took kids this direction and adults this direction, but we had fun. We looked at pictures, talked about things we love. And the setup on this Genesis story is that the reason I read that first text is that God had made a promise. He had made this covenant with Abraham. You will have many descendants. I will forever be your God, and I'll give you this land. And that's before he had any children. So then he has Isaac, and the promise is fulfilled. And Sarah laughs, and they're very, very old. And Sarah laughs because she can't believe it. And they have the child, and then God asks Abraham, probably to the consternation of Abraham's wife, to the consternation of anybody who knew, asked Abraham to sacrifice his own son. The one thing, the very linchpin, the fulcrum, on which the entire story, this promise, this covenant, remember, I'm going to give you many descendants, many people, many nations are going to grow up. And then God says, and I want you to sacrifice your son. Well, my question, if I'm Abraham, is how is this going to happen if I sacrifice my son, right? We've sort of been through this a bit. So that's this odd juxtaposition. So what Abraham was called to do was absolutely preposterous. Preposterous. Foolish. Dumb. Given this earlier promise that God had made, and now you want me to sacrifice my son. This doesn't even make sense. All right? And it's that we are looking at today. I need a few people to pray for me as I preach so that I'll be a pure vessel. If I can ask for a few intercessions in prayer. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that. A couple of things. I'm handing something out. The text for this Sunday was not the text that I read out of the lectionary. The text, there were a few texts, one of which was the parable of the sower and the seeds, which we all probably remember from elementary school. And I thought that, or from Sunday school when we were at elementary age, and I thought about that. It's an easy one to do with the kids and so on and so forth. But I felt called in a different direction this week as I prepared for preaching. But one of the resources I occasionally use is a gentleman by the name of William Barclay. He's a Scottish theologian. He's long since passed from the last century, from the roughly 1940s, 1950s. Brilliant theologian. And but he doesn't talk like a theologian. He's got a lot of great stories, fascinating stuff, and he can really just pull the meat off the bone of a text. And I made copies because I want you to take it with you. All right, you can take as many as you need. I think I've got enough for everybody. But I want you to take this as your sort of devotional for this week, as you reflect not just on today's text, but also think about the parable of the sower and the seeds, and the parable is actually listed there. So take this with you. Go ahead and take one, or one per household, if you need to, whatever. That's fine. But it's just such a great text, and particularly there are a couple of nuggets, little stories he includes, one at the very ending and then one in the middle that are good. And if you read it during my sermon, I will throw this book at you. So I'm preparing for Sunday, and I'm thinking, okay, so when do I hand that out? So if I hand it out at the beginning, they're going to be reading it during Dana's and Billy's very lovely music. If I hand it out afterwards, their mind's already gone, so I'll hand it out before the sermon, but then think, oh, okay, here we go. Yeah, I know what's going to happen there. So this notion of feeling called, that God speaks to us, one of the things that we wrestle with as Christians is, Lord, what is your will for my life? I wrestled with it for a decade or longer. But I began to realize, as I wrestled with that question more and more, and as I, over the years, counseled people, Christians, non-Christians, we all seek to find that purpose in life, right? We're all familiar with the book by Rick Warren, The Purpose-Driven Life. And what did that do? It touched a nerve in society of people wanting to know what their purpose is. I have everything, but what's my purpose? And for those of us who are used to speaking God language, or in Christians, or Jews, or Muslims, in communication with God, the question often is, what do you want from me? What's your will for my life? And what I discovered in my own journeys is that the question of what do you want really needs to be preceded by how are you going to communicate this to me? How does God talk to you? And we've talked about this before. I've preached on this before. But that notion of how does God talk to you? When has it been in your life that you have felt God was communicating with you? And so that's a precursor to the whole discussion of what's God's will for your life. So you've got how does God talk to you? Then what's God saying? And then, of course, do you have the guts to do it? And then the even bigger question, as we saw with the Abraham story, the bigger question is, do you have the guts to do it even if you're going to look like a fool? And we've had some interesting things happen in our congregation this week that I'm not going to go into. Some people taking some risks that went over the last X number of months that have yielded enormous fruit just this past week. Even though they looked like fools when they did it. Or at least they felt they were looking like fools. And so this notion of foolishness. I'm going to read something for you. As I was preparing this week on this notion in these texts, I realized that there's someone who says it far better than me. And if you've read some of my books, you've read this before. If you haven't read my books, maybe you've heard it, but whether you've heard it or not, it bears repeating. It's powerful. So I'm going to read it for you. And what it is, and then I'm going to, just a little bit afterwards, say a few more things afterwards. This is a speech that was given by Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, as you likely know, is the CEO of Apple Computers, as well as Pixar Animation Studios. And this was his. This is an excerpt from his commencement address at Stanford University in 2005. It's very simple, just a couple of little stories, but extremely successful, billionaire, very successful man. I want you to listen to this within the context of this notion of doing something even though everyone around you thinks it's ridiculous. I'm honored to be with you today at your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Remember, he's at Stanford. I never graduated from college. Truth be told, this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. Today I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it, no big deal, just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why did I drop out? That started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed college student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, the people who would become my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We have an unexpected baby boy, do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother later found out that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused, my biological mother, she refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents, the people who would become his parents, promised that I would someday go to college. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost expensive as Stanford, and all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life, so I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at that time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked interesting. But it wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with, and I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. I loved this life. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life, but 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it